The first thing I wanted to talk about was because the summer solstice is a great pagan celebration, and because I think we self-consciously celebrate it with the sense that we are participating in something which goes slightly against the grain of the dominator culture in which we're embedded, and because that culture has made a paragon of reason, I thought it might be fun tonight to just talk a little bit about reason and intuition and the forms and the politics that attend each. So let me dig into this a little and think aloud. Reason, which is always held up as the path to true understanding, has two forms. They are called deduction and induction, and all forms of reason can be subsumed under these two types. Now, deduction, which is considered the stronger form of reason, is called reasoning from first principles, and it works like this. You start from an idea which cannot be proven. You accept it as given, and you reason outward from it. An example that is familiar to all of us would be Euclid's elements of plane geometry. You start with what appears to be an incontrovertible truth, or what we agree appears to be an incontrovertible truth. In the case of Euclid, propositions such as parallel lines never cross, never meet. Well, you can imagine a railroad in your head and run your mind along it to infinity, and then you've inspected the infinite railroad, and lo and behold, at no point did the rails cross. So you accept this as true. Then you can reason from it. Now, in the case of the Euclidean proposition that parallel lines don't meet, you test the truth of it by carrying out this imaginary inspection of the items involved and verifying that the statement appears true in all cases that you can imagine. But other branches of human knowledge also use deduction. Interestingly enough, theology. So theology reasons like in the following manner. God exists. This is perhaps not Christian theology, this is a generic theology. God exists, because Christian theology would seek to go further back and prove, in some cases, such as in scholasticism, that God exists. But let's just start with the given assumption that God exists, and then a second assumption, and God loves us. Given these two assumptions, then deduction goes to work and elaborates an explanation for why we are not with God, how we can get to God, and so forth and so on. So deduction is useful. Notice that my two examples have been drawn from, in the case of Euclid, mathematics, in the case of the second case from theology, a branch of philosophy. So deduction seems to have an important role in these abstract systems. But remember, I said it was one of two forms of reasoning that are ordinarily dealt with. Now, the second form of reasoning is, to my mind, more interesting. The second form of reasoning is induction, not deduction, induction. And induction, for those who believe in it, is thought to be, without doubt, a superior form of reasoning to deduction, because it leads to a control and a manipulation of real consequences in the world. Okay, what is induction and how it works and how does it work? Well, it works like this. When I hit the water with a shovel, it makes a splash. Every time I hit the water with the shovel, it makes a splash. Therefore, this is the leap, the therefore, shovels can be used to make water splash. Now, notice what is interesting about this in contrast to deduction is that there is no untested first principle. You don't state something and then reason from it. You make repetitious observations, and then those observations which are most repetitious you raise to the status of laws. Induction. And this was abhorrent to philosophical thinkers because it doesn't have this Aristotelian purity that deduction has. It doesn't have this mathematical elegance. It's messy. It's all down in the world, observing and comparing and repeating experimentally procedures. But nevertheless, out of inductive reasoning comes the structure of modern science. Okay. But now there's a funny thing about induction. It's making an unstated assumption about time. It is making the assumption that time is invariant. Because what it is saying is, if A precedes B in 1,000 cases, then it is likely that A will precede B in the 1,001st case. In other words, it's a probabilistic theory. It assumes that probabilistic laws give momentum to repetitious observation. Now the question is this so? And the answer is, well, it's so in some cases, but not in the most interesting cases. The most interesting cases, I believe, are the cases which lie in the realm of primary experience of being, the felt experience of being. And in that realm, the realm of love affairs, divorces, lawsuits, religions, political upheavals, and that sort of thing, induction is no good guide at all. One love affair does not explain another. One marriage does not illuminate another. One revolution really does not shed light on another. There may be generalizations, but when you live through these things, what you take from them is the uniqueness of the experience. The first principles that are reasoned from in deduction, whether in the realm of a deductive mathematical system like Euclid or a rational theology, these things are seen to rest on foundations of sand because of this problem of the axiom. In mathematics, the axiom appears fairly secure because it's self-evident, such as parallel lines never meet. It rests on its self-evidence to make its appeal to reason. You see, you can see that it is true, though no one has ever figured out how to prove this. You can see that it is true. But when you move from the realm of axioms to the realm of theological first principles, the appeal then is not at all to the obviousness of it, but to the desirability of it, that God exists, that God loves us. We hope these things are true, but they are certainly not self-evident in the scheme of things from the point of view of most of us. So what this shows then, I think, is that in the matter of deeper things, deductive reasoning rests only on the appeal that hope can lend to its case. Okay, so for me, this is a critique of deduction. Now, what about induction? I referred to the fact that its premises rest on this notion of temporal invariance, which seems to be true only for the grossest of phenomena. Science has made great hay in that dimension by creating laws which are essentially predictive laws of cyclical phenomena that define for us what part of reality goes around and comes around. In other words, we can predict simple phenomena involving the mechanical orbits in gravitational fields. We can make simple predictions about the end results of certain chemical processes, certain nuclear processes, so forth and so on. But when you lay it against the background of nature and experience, it begins to look like pretty thin soup. It's no basis for claiming epistemic preeminence. And this is the point that I want to make. Science claims epistemic preeminence. That means that science doesn't say, we are an ideology like Buddhism and Taoism and the Tarot. They say, we are a metasystem. We shall judge all other systems in our scales. Well, this is politics, but not good philosophy, because there is no basis for this claim to epistemic preeminence. So, this somewhat egghead rave is supposed to pass for a pagan polemic on the summer solstice, because it's an attack on the foundations of reason itself. And as you know, when reason goes, barbarism and madness cannot be far behind. And as a self-declared philosophical anarchist, as in fact the founding member of the Henri Poincaré Anarchist International, our motto is chaos is order. I believe that it's entirely appropriate to carry out an attack on reason. Okay, so then what are we left with? Well, what we're left with is intuition. Intuition. And what is it and how does it work? Well, it's a feeling into things that comes to answers and leaves no trail. That's the thing. It leaves no trail. So you have it, but you haven't the argument for it. And so its power must reside in its truthfulness. So the power of intuition lies in its ability to express truth in contravention to the forward flow of logic and casuistry. Well, is it always to be this? You know how the Tao is presented as this Eastern concept that you can barely wrap your mind around and that hovers at the edge of intelligibility. Well, really, in these so-called obscure Oriental philosophical stances always turn out to have a corollary in Western thinking. And the corollary to the Tao, to Taoism, is intuitionalism, is, an ability to sense the constraints and opportunities in the moment and act through it. Intuition. And intuition is always presented in the dominator society as 1 vague, 2 feminine, 3 unreliable. But this is simply because of this bias toward deductive and inductive systems whose falsity I have just demonstrated to you. In fact, in the felt domain of experience called living, Intuition is how most of us, even the most self-defined as non-intuitional, are operating. Intuition is a kind of field processing of both the foreground and the background of experience. It's a gestalt understanding that is subliminal and that leads the whole organism through an invisible set of creodes towards the maximizing of some kind of a goal. Okay, end of Act 1. The second act opens in the middle of the 19th century with science responding, albeit unconsciously, to an understanding of what I've just said. The inadequacy of reason, the necessity of intuition, and yet all this going on in a domain of Victorian gentlemen with beards to their belts and a world where pianos wore pants. So, it worked its way out subtly in the notion of evolution. And evolution is a very interesting concept that even those of us who profess to believe in it, I think, don't fully grasp, what comes in this package. We all are taught that in the 19th century, a great struggle was waged between science and religion because science had the audacity to suggest that human beings were descended from the great apes. And we all know who took what sides and the kind of polemics that were raised. And we all know the happy ending of this story with the great triumph of modern evolutionary biology. However, that, to my mind, looking at it from the point of view of a philosopher, is all sham. Or it's like the 11 o'clock news version of what actually happened. That's how rather silly people understood the great intellectual watershed struggle of the 19th century. That is not, in fact, what it was about. That's not what it was about. The outrageous assertion of the evolutionists, of Darwin particularly, and his school, was not that human beings were descended from the great apes. In fact, the outrageous assertion wasn't even contained in the part of the manuscript that was called The Descent of Man. You recall it was called The Origin of Species and the Descent of Man, and where the real kicker was lodged was in The Origin of Species. Why? Because Darwin set out to show that nature could be the product of processes without purpose. That was the bit that brought the roof down. Ordinary people couldn't understand this. This is called the so-called teleological issue. But this is what brought the Christian church roaring to its feet in confrontation with evolutionary biology. The assertion that nature could be accounted for by processes that were not guided toward a higher end by a higher power, that simply random molecular processes and then pressures of environmental selection could cause to come to be animals, plants, and ultimately human beings. But the fight was over teleology. The fight was over whether or not the universe has a purpose toward which all creation moves ineluctably, or whether nature is what the Darwinists called it, which was trendlessly fluctuating. Trendlessly fluctuating. So it was an attack on God, not the divinity, not the divine status of man. That was peanuts in this poker game. It was an attack on the need for God per se as an efficient cause in the machinery of universal being? Well, it's a very interesting question and a very interesting struggle, because we are still caught up in it. American transcendentalism, while all this was going on in England, American transcendentalism was exploring the transcendental realms of the human spirit cast against the background of the American landscape. And this question of the telos in nature was, to make friends, lifelong friends, into enemies and sunder families. Alfred Russel Wallace, who was the co-discoverer of evolution with Darwin, really preceded him. He had a fever. He was a professional butterfly collector, as I was once in my youth. And on the island of Ternate in eastern Indonesia, Wallace fell into a malarial fever. And at the height of this fever, he wrote down a page and a half of scribbling, which, when he came down from this illness and read it, it seemed to hold up. And what he had discovered was what all biology was seeking, what he called the solution to the problem of the species. And he looked at this thing, and what it was a description of natural selection. And it seemed to work. Well, Wallace was from the lower classes, had made his living in England as a surveyor, was essentially a field biologist because he was not accepted by the gentleman scientists of England. He didn't know where to turn, so he fired off a letter to the only person he could think of to ask, who was the greatest biologist of the day, Charles Darwin, at home in England in his garden, working over 20 years of notes on the problem of the species. When Darwin got this letter from this unknown character, postmarked Ambon, Dutch East Indies, and read it, he paled visibly. And he went to his friend, Sir Charles Lyell, who was the greatest geologist of the day, the proponent of catastrophism, and was to develop into one of the great defenders of Darwin's theory. He went to Charles Lyell and said, I've been working 20 years on this idea. This came in the post. This is it. It's all here. And Lyell said, don't worry, my friend. We will schedule 2 papers to be delivered at the Royal Society. They will be delivered on the same evening, and yours shall be first. And so it was. And so it comes down to us as Darwin's theory of evolution. But in fact, in a way, for philosophical purists, it may have been better that way. Because Wallace, who was in many ways a deeper thinker than Darwin, was a Fabian socialist, was fascinated by paranormal phenomena, as well as being interested in electricity, biogeography, anthropology, truly one of the last of the great polymaths. Wallace was unable to take the final step on the question of teleology. And he said, I cannot believe that random processes ameliorated by natural selection can give rise to a creature such as man. So this was the break in the 19th century. And it arises out of the earlier foundation of the struggle between intuition and reason. I mean, I think our intuition must place us in Wallace's camp, that there is a telos of some sort. There is an omega point toward which all creation, however unsteadily, moves. And it is because of this omega point that we do live in a cosmos and not a chaos, not simply a raging confusion, but something that is structured and ordered. Well, in spite of the fact that evolution was seeking to serve the most rigorous scientific desires to exclude teleology and to exclude God from the process of the natural world, it introduced a bizarre concept which cut against its own purposes. The concept is a kind of progress in nature where previously none had been, so that from Aristotle to the 19th century, what you have as a theory of nature is what's called the great chain of being, or the great ladder of being. And it stretches from God through the archangels, the cherubim, down man, then the animal kingdom, the vegetable kingdom, so forth and so on. But it is imagined as static, as put in place by the fiat lux of creation, set in place for all time. What Darwin did was to see it as not a great chain of being, but as an escalator of being. He added the notion of progressive movement toward higher and higher forms, more and more complex manifestations of the intrinsic ingression of novelty into actual events. And this idea is very, very interesting and cogent and pregnant with possibility for all of us and our world. You see, what it is really is it's a recasting of an idea that had been banished for several centuries from Western thinking. It is the alchemical idea that nature is driving to perfect itself. This was what the alchemists believed. They believed that through time, lesser metals became gold, and that what the alchemist was trying to do was to compress time. He was trying to catalyze a natural process so that what took thousands, in their imagination, of years in the body of the earth could be compressed into days or weeks in the alembic of the alchemists. Well, as science defined itself throughout the 17th and 18th century under the impetus of Descartes and Kant and all of these people, this notion of the world as a distillate apparatus was given up. But it returns in the idea of evolution, and we inherit it in the social world. Now, this is a delicate point. There is something called social Darwinism, otherwise known as fascism. Social Darwinism uses a very vulgar understanding of evolutionary dynamics to justify class oppression by saying that it must be right that some people have their foot on other people's necks, because isn't this what nature is about? Struggle of the fittest and survival of the longest fang, the swiftest claw, the sharpest tooth. Well, the answer is no, absolutely not. This rests on an understanding of nature that was in vogue 150 years ago, that is not in vogue now. That's what you see when you look at nature in the human dimension. But when you analyze nature as an integrated system of chemical reactions, gene transfer, catalytic self-regulating activities, hypercycles of energy, nutrients, and metabolism, when you analyze nature from that point of view, you see that it seeks to maximize cooperation, connectedness, mutual interdependability is the thing which holds the whole thing together. And the species that is most successful is not the species that can dominate all others. It's the species that can make itself indispensable to all others. Look at the evolutionary success of the bacteria. You know, they settled in for the long haul, and no higher form of life can operate without them. And so the possibility of bacteria becoming extinct is laughable. I mean, they'll be the last to go because they have made themselves indispensable. This idea then of evolution has strongly entered the human world, and science hates this. I had somebody once say to me, if it doesn't involve genes, it ain't evolution. And you should not use the word evolution to describe progressive change. They didn't like that. They said evolution is a technical term used by biologists, and it applies to genetic material only. Books do not evolve, social systems do not evolve, corporations, relationships do not evolve. This is a misuse of the word. Well, since then, evolutionary thinkers like C.H. Waddington, Eric Jantsch, Wes Churchman, Paul Feyerabend, Irvin Laszlo have, I think by the sheer force and volume of their writings, overwhelmed this notion and reclaimed evolution as a much broader concept than it was understood to be in the 19th century. Evolution is now understood to be the triumphant march out of chaos into order, connectedness, self-expression, and self-reflection that begins with the first moments following the Big Bang. In other words, we have we have atomic evolution. Evolution of atomic systems as electrons settle down into stable orbits. We have chemical evolution into more and more complex molecular forms, which finally become polymers. These polymers further evolve into complex intergetic systems capable of self-replication, motility, and eventually, the writing of operas. So what we see when we look at the universe is that you have to be blind to this progressive tendency that has worked its will with the random plasma of pure electrons, with the chemistry of stars, with the molecular chemistry of primitive planets, with plant and animal life, with human epigenetic coding systems, carving, dance, ritual, vocalization, magic, and this process proceeds right up into the 20th century with this phenomenon that we all give some credence to, the notion that we are living in a period of compressed time. Well, so what are we to do with that? I think what we have to do is begin then to design this process. It is now moving fast enough that it is within the ken of each one of us to see progressive consolidation of change taking place in the world around us. We as human beings, I think, are destined to be the design and control element in this thing, in this global Gaian process. Never mind that we have done it so badly up to now, because now, meaning the 20th century, is a completely different kind of epistemic world than any world that preceded it. And to the degree that we can shed the inherited behavior patterns of previous centuries, previous cultural styles, and actually take hold of the tools present at hand, we can guide and control this evolutionary process. Culture as it is, in a sense, the software of the infrastructure of the global civilization, which is the hardware. We don't need to make major design revisions in the hardware. The hardware is how we produce and move around food, how we produce energy. The major restructuring there is simply a matter of cleaning it up, making it more efficient, less toxic, less enslaved to the notion of making a buck, more enslaved to the notion of serving human needs. So the hardware structure can be pretty much redesigned along the lines that are clear to even the engineering mentalities among us. What is not so clear is that culture can be redefined as software and radically rewritten so that it runs much more smoothly. Now notice that I did not say that we were software or hardware. We are neither. We are the user. And this is the important thing to remember. We are not scripting ourselves into some kind of machine future. We are designing the future that we want to have rather than allowing the blunders of our grandparents to dictate the kind of future we will have. We're very late waking up to the necessity for this. This is because we tend to operate along very short-term goals. It's very hard for us to put in place a project that looks 40 or 50 years ahead. It was interesting, a couple of years ago there was an article in the Whole Earth Review about a chapel at Oxford that the main beam of this chapel, which was an oak beam about so by so, was rotted through with worms and had to be replaced. And it was no problem because 800 years ago an English king planted an oak tree that was to be grown for the specific purpose of replacing this beam when it should need to be replaced. And so this 750-year-old oak tree was cut and the beam hewn and put into place. And it inspired them to plant another oak tree, which is not a bad idea. Okay, well, so that's maybe enough about evolution. Now I want to talk about revolution, which is also in the solstitial theme, because what the solstice marks is the return of the heliacal rising of the sun to a certain fixed star against the background of fixed stars in our calendar system. What it really celebrates is the longest day of the year, the day when the sun makes its most northerly, its deepest incursion into the northern latitudes. It's interesting, the theme of revolution is dealt with in the I Ching, and since, of course, the I Ching was one of the 5 Confucian classics, you might turn to that passage expecting a discourse on political reformations. And when you look at the hexagram revolution, it says nothing about political guidance to revolutionaries. It says instead, the magician is a calendar maker. He measures the seasons and he sets them right. And so the last idea, maybe, that I want to leave with you tonight is a few thoughts about the calendar, because I have fastened on to the calendar as an interesting vehicle for changing people's conceptions of reality. I don't think we realize how thoroughly our worldview is dominated by the unconscious preconceptions that are built into our calendar. The Chinese understood this. This is why when there were great social revolutions, a new calendar was always put in place. We have used the present calendar with a minor correction for 2,000 years, for one entire zodiacal age. And we assume, I assume we assume, that we use this calendar that we do because it must be a very good one, and it must be the best of all, and it must be the simplest. And it is true that when you look back into time, you do find bizarre calendrical arrangements. For instance, I don't know if you knew this, but Roman months counted up to the middle day of the month, and then, like a rocket launching, counted down to the end day of the month. This is why the middle day of Roman months, which was called the Ides, was considered an unlucky day, because that was the day that the upward switched to a downward count. Well, we would find this very clumsy. But notice that what the logic, and we've talked about logic, reason, and deduction this evening. The logic behind our calendar is that it is a good solar calendar. Well, what do we mean by a good solar calendar? Well, calendar makers will tell you that a good solar calendar is a calendar such that on the same day of every year, the sun rises in the same place against the background of the fixed stars. This is what we mean when we say the sun is in Aries. We mean that at dawn, the constellation Aries is blotted out by the heliacal light of the rising sun. But the sun is this solar, masculine, Apollonian archetype. It is the archetype of the ego as God. It is the archetype of the center, the unity. The solar calendar is set up so that we do not have what is called a precession. A precession is where the days slip against the background of the fixed stars. The notion of our calendar is that it is an agricultural calendar, and we want our great agricultural holidays to always fall in the times of harvest and planting. So a solar year must be used. But what this does is it has an underlying assumption which is false, and which has been inculcated into our psychology to detrimental ends. And it is this, that this obsession with fixing the solstices and the equinoxes against the fixed stars is the effort to build a structure on the very largest level, the level of the planet itself, to build a structure that is fixed, that is enduring. And the great pride of our calendar is that we say it does not slip. That means it's fixed and enduring. Well, you may not know that the reason it doesn't slip is because there's a fudge factor in it. We're all familiar with the fudge factor of leap year, that every 4 years we have to add a year to keep it okay. But how many of you knew that every century year divisible by 400 is also a leap year, even if it occurs out of sequence? The year 2000 will be such a leap year. It is a century year divisible by 400. So was 1600. And so in that case, you have a leap year, even though the previous or the following year may be a leap year. So there is a fudge factor in the high and mighty solar paternal calendar that keeps it on track. Well, somewhat facetiously, what I propose, at least as a thought model, is an entirely different year length, 384 days. Now, 384 days is an interesting number. It's 13 lunations, precisely 13 lunations. And so we would have, therefore, a need for a 13th month in the calendar. And I propose that the 13th month follow August and precede September and be called Remember. And the month of Remember will be a month of great mnemonic celebration and recovery of the past. It will be a celebration of the past. Well, okay, now we have 13 months. That's wonderful, but we have purchased this 13th month at the expense of 19 days that overshoot the solar year. What about that? Well, instead of viewing that as a problem, as it has always been viewed, let's view it as an opportunity. What happens if you use a day length 19 days longer than the solar year? Well, it means that the great festivals of the solar year, Easter, Christmas, the 4th of July, will, let's call it Independence Day so we don't confuse ourselves because it's going to move, that these great festivals will do what is called precess. Each year they will come 19 days later against the solar year than the year before. So in such a calendrical system, you would be, as a child, Christmas would occur, let us say, in winter. By the time you were in your middle teens, Christmas would be occurring in springtime. By the time you were in your mid-20s, Christmas would be occurring in high summer, and in your mid-30s, it would occur again, it would occur in autumn. And through a life of 60 or 70 years, the solar festivals would migrate through the seasons. Well, this may seem trivial to you, and hey, it may be. But the psychology of it is that it's trying to build in at the highest level a truth which we have lost sight of, which is the idea that everything flows, that everything is impermanent, that flux is the only standard. Flux is the only thing you can depend on. If we gave ourselves permission at the highest and deepest psychological level, the place where we measure time and the spectacle of our life as spread out against the grid of the history that we live through, if we were to give that permission to be portrayed on a grid that emphasized flow, transience, change, and recursion, rather than this constipated solar square against the fixed stars, then what we are really doing, you see, is changing archetypes. We are changing archetypes. And what are we changing? We're changing the Apollonian solar paternalistic dominator archetype for the feminine, oceanic, intuitive, giving and taking archetype of flow and life and death and completion through change, rather than completion which seeks to stave off change and then is inevitably swept away and therefore somehow touched with pathos. Well, maybe that's enough. Maybe there are questions. This was somewhat meandering. I'll recap it for you to try and give you the illusion that there was a plan. We began by celebrating the solstice with an attack on reason and logic and in favor of the primacy of intuition in spite of its nakedness, Intuition cannot clothe itself in the armor of logic. But I hope I demonstrated to you that the armor of logic is wide mesh chain mail. In fact, it's chicken wire. In fact, it may be chicken shit. So the primacy of intuition, and how that intuition led into a peculiar episode in 19th century science, where committed atheists found themselves serving the recovery of the alchemical ideal through the notion of nature as an engine of telos and progressivism. And then from that, the notion of our own century as the concrescence of this teleological process that is leading everything into deeper and deeper modes of self-reflection and connectedness. And then finally, to put the snake's tail in its mouth, to return to the theme of the solstice, and to offer again a counterpose to the calendar of reason, the calendar of solar paternalism, to offer instead a potential calendar in celebration of flux, change, growth, and feminism, which are the values that are going to have to be maximized if we are going to open a dialogue with our souls and the soul of the planet, and save ourselves from the lethal momentum that so many hundreds of years of dominator culture have imparted to the machinery of our civilization. I mean, we must awaken, and these little probes, games about logic and calendars and shifting perspective on these various issues, this is just a way to promote cognitive activity, to say, you know, the path out of the selva oscura, the path out of the dark wood in which we find ourselves, is cognition, thought, getting smart fast. We have to dance, sing, calculate, and drum our way out of the circumstances into which we have fallen. And to the degree that we can celebrate the irrational, the feminine, the unconscious, the transpersonal, and even the psychedelic, to the degree that we can celebrate these things, we are giving permission for the order that is in nature to manifest. The plan wants to come to be. We have to get out of the way. And what that means is all the tricks in the book to diminish ego as a cultural ideal. I mean, ego is not a male problem, it's not a yuppie problem, it's not a white people problem, it's just a problem. And until we get this higher perspective, we are going to continue to rattle the bars of our cage. The higher perspective depends on seeing things on a scale of thousands of years and potentially millions of light years. A cosmic scale, the correct scale, the scale on which we are truly operating. I mean, the minutiae of our personal lives is that. It's that our lives are an opening into a transpersonal opportunity, you know? I mean, I've said this in my smaller class. I take the notion of Tantra seriously if by Tantra what we mean is the shortcut path, that life is some kind of opportunity. It's an opening between unbridgeable chasms of the unknown, and yet out of chaos for 20, 40, 70 years, we come into a domain of immense opportunity. It is a conundrum. It is a puzzle. It is something to be figured out. And I have the faith that if we can figure this out, we can somehow not only make a better world for our children, but in some other profound way, we can even undo what has been done. And this would be the ultimate dream, that somehow we can discover an elegant escape that will leave us with the clear understanding that the problem was an illusion. It was an illusion. It was the last illusion. Facing the answer, or it was a milder version of that, going toward the answer. Okay, now we know what we're talking about. Well, this is the third opportunity that I've had to talk to the community at these Wednesday night lectures. This is the last night of my residence, my scholar in residency at Esalen. So no more will you see the white on a field of vert, which is the escutcheon of the scholar in residence with his towel over his shoulder. Somebody else will have to work a different angle. Somebody else will sit in this chair next month. It was a very interesting, rich time for me, and all kinds of things happened. It was a microcosm of the macrocosm. It changed. There was despair and joy and over-visiting and indigestion and exaltation and dyspepsia and all these things. And I'm very grateful to the regulars who attended my daily lecture. This was about 45 hours of lecture this month, so I'm running on empty. In a certain sense, I really feel like I've run through the major motifs of my point of view, if my point of view is in any sense different from anybody else's. I passed out information on botanical dimensions. I want to mention that again as the practical, real-world anchor of all these ideas. It is a non-profit foundation in Hawaii which preserves plants with a history of shamanic usage, especially plants from the warm tropics. And this is something which is not being done by anyone else. The World Wildlife Fund, these large conservation organizations are saving the rainforest by preserving huge tracts of it. But what is not being preserved is human understanding of the rainforest, specifically human understanding of medicinal plants. And considering that quinine, the cure for malaria, reserpine, the first of the tranquilizers, and many other major drugs with a significant impact on human health have come from the warm tropics, including possibly now a cure for AIDS in the form of the trichosanthus extract that's being experimented with. It's very important to preserve the medically important biota of the warm tropics, and this is something which means taking seriously the shamanism and the traditions that live in those areas. So this is something that my wife Kat and I have been doing for over about 12 years, and about 5 years ago incorporated as a non-profit foundation. If you're interested in this kind of hands-on plant rescue information rescue work, why, please write to us at the address on the handout. This is well, I figure we have about 25 years before this information will be completely assimilated into the encroaching consumer society, the leveling of values that seems now to be an inevitable part of the globalizing of society. On one level, it's very good. We recognize ourselves in our enemies, and there's a commonality of values generated. But on another level, it's tremendously destructive of novelty and uniqueness. I mean, we're turning the whole planet into a white bread mall shopping culture, and the values of every other way of doing things is being subsumed to that. I talked a lot in these Wednesday night lectures and with the section about the importance of partnership societies in the human past, and how the nostalgia for these kinds of social arrangements have driven us throughout our experience of history. Well, it is nevertheless true that even today in the Amazon and perhaps in a few other relict environments, partnership societies exist. Partnership societies thrive and regulate themselves through a symbiotic relationship to plants that we call hallucinogenic plant shamanism, but which is actually almost a welding of the social organism into the natural surround in a way that feeds back into the psyches of these people and the structures of their society in a way that is very much promotes the conservation of equilibrium, something we have sadly lost touch with. So it's very important to preserve the options that have been discovered by people over the millennia, the options that allow a recreation of the sensory and psychic ratios that characterize the partnership society, in contrast to the kind of dominator society that we've lived under for such a long time. So it isn't a matter simply of preserving plants for medicines. It's really much more philosophically deep than that. It's the idea that a relationship to the vegetable matrix of the planet is what constitutes a Gaian resurgence, that it is plants that regulate the composition of the atmosphere, the temperatures of the oceans, so forth and so on, and that it is our lack of integration into that system that has precipitated the crisis of toxic 20th century potlatch civilization. By potlatch was a custom of the Northwest Coast Indians, where they would, to show their wealth, destroy huge amounts of material so that houses would be burned, feathered blankets burned, totem poles burned in the potlatch, in an orgy of destruction which proves your wealth. And we have assimilated and perfected this custom so that it is second nature to us. And the whole planet is a vast potlatch. We are robbing our children and their children of any sort of recognizable future by basically grabbing it all for ourselves. No other society in history has been so callous to human values that it condemned generations unborn of its own children to live in a desert. Nevertheless, this is our style. We're trying to do something about this at Botanical Dimensions by preserving these plants with a shamanic history. If you're interested, contact botanical dimensions about that. Well, what I thought I would do this evening is offer not a summation of content, which I gave yesterday at the section of what this month has been, but instead of a summation of content, a kind of summation of intention. What was intended to come across, and what now, having lectured 45 hours, stands out in my mind as essential to what I'm trying to put across. The main thing, I think, that comes out of an effort to formulate a psychedelic point of view, and I take it this is what we have been involved in. A psychedelic point of view means a point of view which honors consciousness. Consciousness is seen as the value to be maximized. That's what we want. We want more consciousness, better integration, better information, better models. We don't want to petrify ourselves or commit ourselves to a model that somehow then is found to be obsolete and inadequate. So what chiefly constitutes the psychedelic point of view, I think, is its open-ended and provisional nature, as opposed to every other ideology or point of view that's running around. We have to, what the psychedelic point of view is a kind of cultural relativism. We're trying to get a grip on who and where we are in the cosmos from a point of view not that of the American consumerist citizen, something else, something larger, deeper, broader, more touched by the cosmic, more touched by a sense of the past and of destiny. So I have said this many times, but I want to say it now in a slightly different context and discuss it. The statement of the British enzymologist J.B.S. Haldane, who discovered enzymes, so he became an enzymologist, a logical move. Haldane said, the world is not only stranger than we suppose, it is stranger than we can suppose. And this is something that we have not entertained very seriously as a possibility, especially the cheerful characters in the white coats with the clipboards. The assumption has always been that man's mind, notice the gender slant, man's mind is sufficient for the cognition of the cosmos. This is not all that surprising, though it is patently idiotic. It is not all that surprising when you think about the fact that as recently as, let's say, 1830, people believed the Earth was 4,000 years old. As recently as 1480, the New World was unsuspected to exist, or it was suspected by a few wild-eyed map makers and mad sailors. But conventional knowledge held that, you know, the Eurasian landmass in connection with Africa, that was it. So when we look back into our recent past, we discover tremendous epistemic naivete. That means people didn't know what was going on. They weren't even close. And yet we are asked to believe that somewhere after Darwin and before now, it was all figured out. And now we view the universe from a lofty pinnacle of integrated understanding. Now the physics explains biology, biology explains culture, culture explains sociology, so forth and so on. Well, you know, this is really whistling past the graveyard, because meanwhile the visible consequences of this understanding are spreading chaos, a dissolution of values, an inability to control technology, an inability to set reasonable political goals such as moderation of population growth and carry them out. Instead, somehow this deep insight into how everything works has left everything a mess. And, what does that mean about us? Why is that, and what can be done about it? Well, I think the problem is that we have too long ignored the possibility that reality is stranger than we can suppose. I mean, let this reverberate in your mind. Not that means no model will ever work. It means it will always be provisional, that the understanding of what it is will always recede ahead of any epistemic program to describe, enclose, explain. This is all a fallacy if you believe that you are embarked on a finite project where eventually you will issue a white paper and that will explain how the boar ate the cabbage. It's not to be explained. And we have, I think because of unique characteristics of the male ego, chosen to operate with the assumption that we can understand, that the human mind can in fact grok larger and larger levels of embeddedness and make sense of them. What the psychedelic experience, number one, and point of view, number two, is saying is that we have the means present at hand to completely explode this nonsensical fiction of certitude. And yet we choose not to confront it. This is why I first proposed calling this Facing the Answer, because the answer about how you understand the universe is the same answer that you get when you ask the question, how am I to understand my own life? It can't be understood. It is a receding mystery. It is a continuing carrot. It cannot be brought under the aegis of rational apprehension. It says in Moby Dick, reality outran apprehension. It always outruns apprehension, because apprehension is the primitive functioning of the primate neural network. And reality, who knows? Who would even care to take a guess, It's a mystery. You do not measure the depth of a universal mystery with the neural network of a primate. Our role is not to understand, but to appreciate. To appreciate. We have an immense capacity for resonance with beauty, aesthetic awareness, appreciation of form, appreciation of how things go together. Notice this word appreciation, appreciation. If you don't know what's going on at a dinner party, in a corporation, in an environment, then the best course is to keep your mouth shut and pay attention and try to appreciate the situation. It's ridiculous to attempt to seize the tiller of reality because we don't even know where we want to go. So the notion that by creating these models of reality, which are not acknowledged as models, but which are called scientific truth, we betray ourselves down the primrose path that leads to dreary, dusty death. Because what we do is we take the poetry out of being. We extract the poetry from being by the assumption of the mundane. The banality of modernity is what I call this. The banality of modernity, the steady flattening of values so that nothing means much. The sense of outrage over political mistreatment of the underprivileged, or the sense of outrage as a society slips toward the abyss, or the sense of outrage when people mistreat you, is muted. Everything is flattened by the banality of modernity. This is the heritage of all the bad little boys of the 19th century, Nietzsche and Darwin and Hegel and Schopenhauer. These clowns were on a bad trip, and they were loud about it. And what they give us is a universe devoid of soul. Man looms larger and larger. Notice the gender slant. Man looms larger and larger in the picture. And what this ushers into is fascism, pure and simple. And it's not surprising, because this calling forth of the image of man into larger and larger perspective has been the program of monotheism for 3,000 years. It has been a relentless accentuation of the centrality of the human image, the male dominant human image. And in the transmutation of Hellenistic Judaism that becomes Christianity, the final apotheosis of this point of view is created in the notion that man can be God. That's it. And it is hailed as a tremendous infusion of existential validity into the human image, the greatest stride ever, the greatest single stride ever taken in the definition of human ontology. Well, I would like to suggest to you it was the greatest backward step ever taken, because what it did was it shoved nature further and further into the background. Nature is something from which we torment her secrets. This is Francis Bacon. We torture nature to obtain her secrets. The world is created for man. It is for man to remake in his image all this gender stuff. And it is then no wonder that building on that foundation, 19th century rationalism, which thought it was putting these things behind it, it conceived itself as anti-clerical, as monotheism and Christianity in some sense, and yet what it really did was it just stripped away the Baroque trappings. Hans Jonas was very acute in pointing out that 3rd century Hellenistic Gnosticism and Heideggerian philosophy are essentially the same thing. It's just that in the Gnostic recension, you get all these sexy, you get demons and angels and levels and the emanation from the pleroma and the clash of the archons. Opera. In the Heideggerian recension, they've just gotten down to the nitty-gritty, but the message is the same. Man is thrown into the unknown. Man is in the abyss, lost. All meaning must come from within. All order must come from an inner vision. We are abandoned. This is Heideggerian language. We are abandoned. Well, this is permission then for pathology, because it is a point of view purchased at the cost of ignoring the facts of the matter. And that is, in my definition, a delusion. A point of view purchased at the expense of the facts of the matter. Whitehead said there are stubborn facts. You can reduce and reduce all you want, but there are certain stubborn facts. Well, one of them is the primacy of nature, a stubborn fact which was ignored by this tradition. Once nature is taken as the ground of being, then the permission to inflate the image of the ego is denied. And I think that this is happening globally, very slowly, under pressure, under duress, because our backs are to the wall. We are seeing a planetary crisis unfold before our eyes. And, blame has not yet come into the rhetoric, but eventually it's going to be understood who's to blame. And it isn't the tribesmen of New Guinea or the Indians of Siberia. It is Western, male, scientific, technological hubris that has claimed center stage like a noisy drunk and then just proceeded to hold us all prisoner while it acted out a process that is rooted in its own traumatic birth, in the sundering of the symbiotic relationship to the vegetable matrix that characterized prehistory. Well, so what I'm offering as a counterpoise to that is this notion of provisional models. Nature is not mute. This is what Sartre said, nature is mute. He was another one of these people who pushed this existential line in one form or another. Nature is not mute. Nature is full of affection and intentionality toward humankind. But intuition must be given prominence in the rearrangement of our relationship with the world. And I talked the other night about induction and intuition, and I want to say just a little bit more about it tonight. Different things. Science runs on induction, which is a very low-grade form of logic. It means you do something over and over again, and if it happens the same way 100 times, you have confidence that the 101st time it will happen the same way. Intuition doesn't work like that. Intuition, as I said the other night, leaves no trail. And most of us are accustomed to thinking of intuition as something feminine, mysterious, unexplainable, and sort of magical. And also, I think, because we live in a male-dominant society, we undervalue it. If someone claims intuition, our position is probably one of prove it, doubt in the face of the assertion, you see. But there's an interesting thing about intuition that I don't think many people understand or have bothered to look at, which is, did you know, I'll bet you did know, mathematics is based on intuition. Now, half of mathematics would rise with a screech of horror at this statement. But the other half of mathematics calls itself intuitional mathematics. Okay, well now what's going on here? Probably if you are not a professional philosopher of science, you are accustomed to associating mathematics with science rather closely. This is because science, in order to give itself legitimacy, has very slyly appropriated mathematics, especially in the 20th century, to its purposes. But if we talk about what is called pure mathematics, which is the great love of mathematicians, the other kind of mathematics is applied mathematics, and that's for engineers and technologists and is not, what moves them to the edge of their chair. But if we think about pure mathematics, it is an activity carried on in the mind, based on deductive truth. Deductive, not inductive. In other words, a statement is made. It can be anything. All grays are non-X. This is just a statement. We don't yet know what this is going to be about. All grays are non-X. All greens are F sub 1. What we're putting in place are a set of statements that appear nonsensical, but what we will assert is that we should seek a relationship between them and that will then show us something. And this is how mathematics really works. It has very little to do with number. It has to do with the conceptualizing of relationships
conceptualizing them, and then exploring your intuition about these conceptions. And then the third and very late stage is you write a formal statement of your cognitive activity around these assumptions. So you see, mathematics is entirely intuitional. It leaves no track. It is drawn from this other domain. Well, why has it been appropriated by science? Well, for a very funny and not well understood reason. Mathematics has been appropriated by science because mathematics has an uncanny ability to describe nature. Completely uncanny. Now, you may have never asked yourself, why is mathematics such a powerful tool for the description of nature? Maybe you thought that somebody else can answer this and that it's not a problem. Well, I've got news for you. It is a problem. Nobody has any good ideas about why mathematics describes nature, but notice that mathematics is an intuitional activity. An intuitional activity describes nature without the intercession of inductive science. Inductive science is a kind of naive holdover from Greek Democritean theories, where everything is conceived of as clearly conceivable and operating according to known laws. But in fact, the deeper structure of nature is not modeled out of an examination of data obtained by measurement. That isn't how it works these days. The deeper description of nature is achieved by taking weird objects from the frontiers of mathematics, these things dreamed up in the confines and depths of the human mind and inside computers, and then laying them over nature and seeing, my gosh, there's a one-to-one correspondence between, let us say, the multidimensional catastrophes described by René Thom and the dripping of a faucet, the turbulence in a brook, the voting patterns in a ghetto. All of these things are seen to be easily modeled by extremely exotic mathematical objects discovered through intuition within the mind. Well, what does this mean? Well, it means, if it means anything, I mean, before we draw the deeper conclusion, what is the conclusion on the surface? It must be that the unaided human mind is more capable of correctly modeling nature than the human mind that works through the methodological inductive approach called science. And in fact, this is clearly true because the world described by science, a scientific description of this room, would say very little about all the important things going on in it. A scientific description of this room would leave out personality, would leave out linguistic intent, would leave out the uniqueness of each of us. For science, we are merely members of the human species. Again, this flattening, this reductionism, this betrayal of the quintessence of the phenomenon in a desperate effort to achieve closure in the modeling process. And so then you do achieve closure, but the model is always inadequate. It's always inadequate. So then there's this sense of frustration. We can't get closure with the model unless we tell a lie, unless we deny the complexity, the interrelatedness, the soulness, the spiritness, the mindfulness. All of these things are, for science, what are called secondary properties. They are epiphenomenal. They are only an aspect of your point of view. like an iridescence on a butterfly's wing or something like that. In fact, that is the classic reductionist definition of consciousness. It is an iridescence that appears on the surface of neural processing that we mistake for true being. And yet somehow we are embedded within this iridescence, and it is from within this iridescence that we launch the descriptive models that then deny our existential validity. Well, so this has been an onanistic exercise, is one way of putting it, and there must be others. Okay, so then what is the path of intuition in relationship to nature that is different from the path of science? In a way, it's only a shift of emphasis. William Blake said, "Attend the minute particulars." Attend the minute particulars. This is very good advice for science, and it is very good advice for mathematics. And what I'm suggesting here tonight is that we have misconstrued mathematics and have bought the notion that it is a part of science, when actually it stands ready to empower intuition and to sweep science, if not away, at least into a more proper role, more befitting its extremely limited application to the higher orders of reality that we really care about. I mean, science is really, it's the plumbing level of reality. It doesn't catch, the integrated nature of language, the evolution of fairy tale, the dynamics of love affairs, the quintessence of genius. These are the things that as human beings structure and constellate and guide and inform our world. And science has nothing to say about these things. Mathematics, on the other hand, is like the bedrock celebration of these things. It empowers intuition. It discovers intuition to be the most powerful epistemic tool that we have. More powerful than induction, more powerful than deduction. Intuition is the unifying of experience into a gestalt image of the world, a coming together within the organism of a correct imaging of the world. Now, what do I mean by correct imaging? All I mean is a provisional image that carries you to the next moment. This is all we can hope for at this stage. We are much more suited for dancing than for whatever it is that we have been doing. Whatever it wasn't dancing. We are a part of nature. We are a part of light. We are a part of the energy field of the planet. We are not its keeper in the sense that it is not given unto us to understand it. That was all a horrible misunderstanding. The idea that we should understand reality and then somehow make something of it. Alfred North Whitehead said that understanding is the apperception of pattern as such. As such. That's all. So here we have a room full of people. Well, it's a pattern. It's many patterns. It's the pattern of how men and women are mixed together statistically as we scan from left to right. If I see a pattern there, I know something about the crowd. I understand something about the crowd. The pattern tells me something, and I call that understanding. But we could analyze the crowd from the point of view of the distribution of young people and old people, or people in colors in the red-blue spectrum as according to the yellow-white spectrum. Each one of these things is a way of analyzing the pattern in the room. And each one of these patterns tells the perceiver more about what is going on in the room. Because the room is not a distribution of young people and old people. a distribution of men and women, or a distribution of garment colors. The room is a mystery, a recessional mystery that presents itself as a series of interlocking patterns of infinite depth. And so in building collective epistemologies, this is what we must ask of these epistemologies, that they give us the experience of understanding. And the experience of understanding is largely intuitional. How much of an experience of understanding do you have when you examine what modern physics is saying about the origin of the universe? I submit not much, because it is so clearly the product of abstraction, the product of the phonetic alphabet, the male ego. They've set all the interesting stuff back in the first 3 minutes. Who can go and look? It's all stacked against empowering the perceiver. It's all stacked against empowering the perceiver. You can't even check the statements these people are making unless you happen to have a $125 million colliding Bevatron or something, and the understanding to use it and interpret the results. So what we have is a priesthood off on the edge of things, propounding great profundities that nowhere touch the heart, nowhere empower the individual, nowhere strengthen the dyad, or reinforce the family, or give support to the downtrodden. It doesn't seem to be about that. In other words, the explanation of the world is not a human explanation. A human explanation must come from intuition. It must come from poetry. It must come ultimately from experience. And by experience, I don't mean the experimental method of science, which is that things are pulled apart, taken down to their lowest common denominator, and then described. I mean, if you do, that's like believing that you understand Los Angeles if you have the telephone directory, you know? I mean, this is the level of genetics today. What they say they understand life, and they have the telephone directory, and they're talking about Los Angeles, because they can look up, you know, where the genes are, the coding for the proteins, you know. Does this tell us anything about a broken heart, or a Messiah, or a Hitler? I don't think so. So what we are trying to do is return the focus of attention to individual experience. We have been slave too long to ideology transmitted hierarchically and based on a tremendously alienating instrumentality. That's what science depends on now, a tremendously alienating instrumentality. What we need to do is empower experience. Well, this is where the psychedelics come in, because citizens don't take psychedelics because it's illegal. Neither do marionettes, neither do robots. None of these well-behaved and mechanistic reductionist images of humanity take psychedelics because it's misbehaving. Misbehaving is a great sin. In fact, it's enshrined as the first sin. You'll regard that the psychedelic issue was there in Eden, and somebody misbehaved, and then they got tossed out forever and their children's children into the chaos of history. It's interesting to read in Genesis why this was. It was because they will become as we are, says Yahweh. They will become as we are if they eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge. I suggest to you that this is precisely what we should seek to do, and that this we is the voice of hierarchy, the voice of paternalism, the voice of the male ego finally right up into the storm god, the volcano god who lies back there in the origins of monotheism. We empower our experience by insisting on our authenticity. It's a wonderful thing to learn to be able to stand up and yell bullshit. I did it when I was about 18 years old, and it was the meme of the hour, and it blew their minds. It did blow their minds. It was uncivil. It was uncivil. It lacked polity. It was rude and crude and correct, because so much is being slung, and nobody is talking about the primacy of experience and the dignity of the individual. The dignity of the individual. We went a long way with this in America before we betrayed it. And it wasn't only betrayed by the clowns in Washington. It's also betrayed by anybody who clusters themselves around the feet of some self-proclaimed nabob. Because the fact of the matter is, nobody knows what's going on. Nobody knows. Nobody has the faintest idea. The best guesses are lies. You may be sure of it. And so to pretend that one human being will lead another out of the dark night of ignorance and into the shining light of truth is ludicrous, absolutely grotesque, a product of this empowering of the human image that has gone on through several thousand years of dominator culture. If you want a teacher, try a waterfall, or a mushroom, or a mountain wilderness, or a storm-pounded seashore. This is where the action is. It's not back in the hive. It's not in the anthill. It's not knocking your head against the floor in front of somebody who claims that because of their lineage and whose feet they washed and whose feet they washed, that you should give credence to them. Knowledge is provisional, and we are yet to approach even the first moment of civilized understanding. The way it is to be done is by trusting yourself, trusting your intuition. Reject authority. Authority is a lie and an abomination. Authority will lead you into ruin. It's not real. And it isn't, don't get the idea that it's this liberal rap about how everybody has a piece of the action. You know, the Jews know something, the Buddhists know something, the Huichol know something. Nonsense. Rubbish. Nobody knows anything. These are different kinds of shell games that have been worked out by priestly castes of people to keep things under control. Institutions seek to maximize control, control, control. That's what they're into. Did you think they were in the business of enlightening you? Saving your soul? Forget it. Control is what this is all about. And to the degree that we commit ourselves to ideology, we are poisoned. Any ideology, Marxism, Catholicism, objectivism, you name it, rubbish, all rubbish. What is real is experience. What is real is this moment. And so then what it becomes about is, what are the frontiers of experience? How much of that has been taken away from us by these dominators, by these priesthoods, by these cults, by these philosophical shell games? Well, a lot. That's the whole story of history. Our growing unease, our growing dis-ease, our malaise is all about the fact that we are kept from the wellspring of experience. We are sexually repressed. You may not feel it, but look back 100 years to a world where pianos wore pants. You know, maybe we've made a little progress on the sexual thing. Maybe not. Maybe more or less than we think. But we are repressed in all of these areas. And we are particularly repressed in the area that relates to the psychedelic experience. Because it is it is raid to the dominator insect invasion. They can't take it. They can't stand it because it empowers the individual. It dissolves the cheerful model of science. It's just exposed as, a nice story. It enriches the accessible universe tenfold, 100-fold, 1,000-fold. It makes the individual complete within his or her self. And this completion of the individual is extremely destructive to the plan of the dominators, which is that you will be a cog in a machine. You will participate in the life of an organization, not your life, the life of an organization. You will go to some bullshit job. You will pour the best years of your life and your genius and your hopes into this. You will serve an institution. You will serve. Well, it's a bad idea for free people to go along with this. A much better idea would be to insist on the dignity of human beings, to recognize that the freeing of slaves, the giving of the vote to women, the ending of public whippings, that this program of political enlightenment must also then include hands-off on how people want to relate to changing their minds. We are not interested in being sexually regulated by the state, and we are not interested in being intellectually, spiritually, emotionally manipulated by the state. The state should stand down in this issue. The state is acting as the enforcing arm of the dominator culture, specifically of fundamentalist screwballs who, are horrified by all this, by the notion that people would claim the authenticity of their own minds, that people would stand in the light of nature and reject original sin and the guilt from Eden and, the sins of the fathers and all this rubbish which is handed down. What the archaic revival is going to have to mean, if it has teeth, is a re-empowering of the individual and a consequent lowering of the profile of institutions, especially government. We need to think about these things because we have bought into the idea that we have to serve and behave and be enslaved, else chaos will engulf the world. We need to carry out our analysis of the situation to the point where we can embrace chaos and see that chaos is the environment in which we all thrive. That's how I've done it for years. You think I could have gotten away with this in the Soviet Union? I don't think so. I require a society on the brink of social breakdown to be able to do my work. And I think a society on the brink of social breakdown is the healthiest situation for individuals. I don't know how many of you have ever had the privilege of being in a society in a pre-revolutionary situation, but the cafes stay open all night, and there's music in the streets, and you can breathe it, you can feel it, and you know what is happening. The dominator is being pushed. It never succeeds. It never is able to claim itself. But on the other hand, history is young. We may have a crack at this. A global society is coming into being. A global society made out of information that was not intended to be ours, but which is ours through the mistaken invention and distribution of small computers, the printing press, all of this stuff. Information is power, and information has been spilled by the clumsy handling of the cybernetic revolution by the dominator culture so that it is everywhere. Never has the situation been more fluid. Never have the opportunities for infiltration insurrection and hell-raising been more present at hand. But we have to seize the opportunity. We have to seize the opportunity because the world doesn't have that much more to run unless somebody begins to shake the apple cart. If we don't begin to shake the apple cart, then the apple cart is just going to sail over the cliff and be lost. So the psychedelics are very hot in this because they dissolve boundaries. They dissolve assumptions. And our task, our being the everyone who seeks self-empowerment through experience, our task is to dissolve the assumptions of the dominator culture and make it impossible for it to work. This, I think, is already happening. We have nature on our side, you see. Nature is beginning to kick up. And, you know, it may alarm you that they're cutting down the Amazon rainforest, but imagine if you were the clown who owns it, how alarmed he is. He sees it as an investment. He thinks he owns it. And when he sees that it's being destroyed, he's extremely alarmed. The fact that nature is itself being seen as a limited resource is a tremendous tilt to our side, because the provisional model, psychedelic, open-ended partnership way of doing things is the only style that can perhaps seize the controls of this sinking submarine and get it back to the surface so that we can figure out what should be done. If we continue as we have, then, you know, we're doomed. And the judgment of some higher power on that will be, they didn't even struggle. You know, they went to the boxcars with their suitcases and they didn't even struggle. This is too nightmarish to contemplate. We're talking about the fate of a whole planet. Why are people so polite? Why are they so patient? Why are they so forgiving of gangsterism and betrayal? It's very difficult to understand. I believe it's because the dominator culture is increasingly more and more sophisticated in its perfection of subliminal mechanisms of control. And I don't mean anything grandiose and paranoid. I just mean that through press releases and sound bites and the enforced idiocy of television, the drama of a dying world has been turned into a soap opera for most people. And they don't understand that it's their story and that they will eat it in the final act if somewhere between here and the final act they don't stand up on their hind legs and howl. So this whole effort to bring the psychedelic experience back into prominence is an effort to empower individuals and to get them to see that we are bled of our authenticity by vampirish institutions that will never of their own accord leave us alone. There must be a moment when the machinery and the working of the machinery becomes so odious that people are willing to stride forward and throw sand on the track and force a reevaluation of the situation. And it's not done through organizing. It's not done through vanguard parties or cadres of intellectual elites. It's done through just walking away from all of that, claiming your identity, claiming your vision, your being, your intuition, and then acting from that without regret, cleanly, without regret. Thank you very much. I'll take questions. Does anybody have a question?
I have a statement, Robert.
Oh, good. I thought it was going to be something else. Yes, sir.
Well, the reason I don't take psychedelics at the same frequency as I used to when I was younger is not because I view it as misbehavior, but because I've read enough research articles that scare me, and because I've counseled enough individuals who have taken a lot of psychedelics, and their behavior gives me pause for concern. And I'm a little concerned that you seem to be overlooking some of these
Yes, well,
facts.
have you ever heard me before? Because I've never seen you before. Is that true? You've heard? Yeah. Well, see, this is the culmination of a fairly intensive presentation that dealt with every drug in detail, doses, toxicity, the problems of set and setting, the problem of synthetic versus natural, the problem of hedonic patterns of use, addiction, social factors, all of this stuff. So if you just walked in and here's this character advocating this thing and it sounds pretty wild-eyed, there are lots of constraints on my recommendation that I hope most of the people in the audience are aware of. I'm not advocating unrestricted use of drugs. In fact, I'm fairly Calvinistic about drugs. I like plants. I think drugs should mimic neurotransmitters. I think the closer they are to ordinary brain chemistry, the less invasive they are, and this is very important. Granted, there are psychedelic drug casualties, but without, and you mentioned papers that you've read, this was your weakest argument, because human research has been so stifled by government control over the past 25 years that there is none. So what you're talking about is either rat data, which has its place, but is by no means the last word, or you're talking about 25-year-old research that has never been looked at. I believe, and part of the reason I'm here, and part of the reason I try to speak to these kinds of audiences, is that psychedelics at this stage in the process must be welded to the notion of psychotherapy. Not strongly, but that we need sitters, we need empathetic people, we need people who have seen people go through a lot, and those people can help people to come to terms with the psychedelic experience. It is, to me, a travesty that we are so infantile, and have been for centuries, that we accept lives where we go from the cradle to the grave without the psychedelic experience. This is like choosing not to have sex. It's that important. It's that central to who you are. And, you know, there are celibate people, but I don't see them as experts on how to live. And I certainly don't think that people who are completely unaware of the psychedelic experience have very much to say to the rest of us, even if they hang out shingles that say that they're psychoanalysts or psychotherapists or something like that. I mean, it's the mind. It's a huge portion of the mind. If you are treating mad people, severely disturbed people, you as a resident should have been exposed to situations of severe disturbance and quasi-madness and abreaction and recovery of traumatic material. Otherwise, you're just polishing the Cadillac in darkness. You work from theory. God, working on the mind from theory, when here are traditions of psychedelic plant use thousands of years old that have evolved into extremely sophisticated mental health care delivery systems. It's just to tie the physician's hands and to tie the individual's hands. I don't say that it's not dangerous. And the more ignorant you are, the more dangerous it is. This is certainly true. If you're thinking about taking psychedelics, the first stop should be the library. read what is said and read it with a critical eye, and then talk to people. That's the next thing. The library is not itself sufficient because funny notions get carried along in the literature, and many a researcher has given LSD or psilocybin to many, many graduate students and never really taken it themselves. I mean, I know these people, and they're very hands-off, and they fear madness. They are self-diagnosed as mad, and so they will not take psychedelics. And they are mad. They're right. They know it. Anybody who runs around in a white coat with a clipboard pontificating to the rest of us based on ratomorphic data is a mad person. And so they're terrified of it. But if you haven't worked yourself into that kind of a position, you don't have to have this same set of reflexes. It's very, very threatening to the male ego. And when you get into the professional scientist, the professional jurist, judiciary, government, this is all about holding it in and role-playing and always being right and always appearing correct in the eyes of your colleague. This is no place where somebody is going to experiment with something which is going to have them howling at the moon, even if that's what they need. So I appreciate your concern. I'm the guy who says these terrible things, and you just happen to wander in here. I'm the only guy around who does this. And I apologize for your discomfiture, but maybe that reassures you. There aren't dozens or hundreds of people like this. Anybody else? Sure.
I was recently teaching, lecturing a little bit on Weinberg's first 2 minutes, and the ecstasy from understanding the mathematics behind the motion of a star. It's very beautiful, real. And if we don't take the institutions, understand the calculus, take the time, use them, we have lost it also. Because we cannot control it. If they go beyond us, we cannot control it. If we do not take their knowledge and then build on it and use what you say, then we have lost it also.
Yes, well, I think I made it clear. I'm all for appropriating mathematics. That's all we need. The mathematics is how they did their magic, even though science is tremendously epistemically naive. The weird thing about science, you see, is that it's very old. Science is old. I mean, it was practiced in the 5th century BC, and like any old enterprise, its most basic assumptions are its least examined assumptions. And so science makes a whole bunch of assumptions that it always has made. One of them I attack tonight, the knowability of the universe. Science assumes that the universe can be known. I see no reason to be persuaded of this. The other is that time is an invariable, that you see science rests on experiment. And the idea is that whenever you perform an experiment, that doesn't matter. So the notion of the non-variance of time, and yet in our love affairs, in our marriages and careers and the corporations we move through and so forth, we see that timing is always of the essence. No love affair is like any other love affair. No corporate takeover is like any other corporate takeover. These are highly complex phenomena that the assumption of temporal invariance there is completely inappropriate. I agree that there is elegance and thrill in the explanation of process. I came up through science. I mean, I'm very sympathetic to it. It is an epistemology of great power, but it is not a meta-epistemology. It is not so powerful that other epistemological systems should seek to be judged by it. And this is what science always wants to do. It wants to say, astrology, that's nonsense. Well, find a scientist who can cast a horoscope. You know, these people who signed this statement a few years ago that astrology was a pseudoscience, not one could cast a horoscope. Not one had the faintest notion what was actually going on. They simply saw that it was not scientific. And for them, if it's not scientific, it's no good. But science itself has been effective only in very provisionally defined areas. I mean, it's great on the energies of the atom. It's very good with astrophysics, but you know, the data, who has access to it in the primary form except people with enormous instruments? But science has not delivered an understanding of man or society or planetary dynamics or the mind or free will. All of this has been completely outside of its ken. So it is an epistemic tool of great power. So is Taoism, so is magic, so is intuition. Astrology has its place. There is no meta-epistemology. There is, you see, this is something people don't understand. All you can ask of a theory, an idea, a model, all that you can ask of a model is that it be internally consistent. That means that within its own terms, it doesn't contradict itself. If it contradicts itself within its own terms, it's just ridiculous, and we don't have to worry about that. Astrology does not contradict itself within its own terms. It's a set of interlocking concepts, modalities, calculations, mathematical formulae, and it all works. Atomic physics, a similar structure. But you don't ask, does atomic physics contradict astrology? They're not the same system. They do not say anything about each other. They are completely different things, and they are, as intellectual objects, they have the same dimensionality, and they exist on the same plane. One is not superior to the other. So internal self-consistency is all that is required of an idea or a personality or any organism. That's what an organism is. It's an internally self-consistent operating system of some sort. And science was so successful in areas which impacted very strongly on daily life that it was allowed to make this claim to epistemic preeminence without ever being slapped down and told, you know, that's none of your business. That's not part of what you're about. And whenever you see scientists pontificating on non-scientific subjects, you should realize that these are utterly ordinary people. They don't have any special insight at all. They are practitioners of a certain point of view, but that doesn't empower them to pass judgment on all other points of view. That's where they have gotten into a hubristic delusion. So science where appropriate, and only where appropriate. Anybody else? No. Okay. Well, I want to thank you all again, not only for this evening, but for the month. And Esalen is a wonderful second home to me and my wife and my children. I'm very concerned about free speech, freedom of thought. These things are endangered memes. Esalen has always tolerated and even encouraged me, and I think this is extremely laudable and brave. They don't have to do that. Somebody else could sit here and amuse you and it wouldn't cause any ripples. So I'm very appreciative to Esalen for its commitment to free speech. I'm appreciative to you. This may have outraged some of you. You were very noble about it. Civilized dialogue is our last best hope, and we must preserve theaters and opportunities for civilized dialogue. The best idea will win. The best idea will win. Thank you very much.
Mulder? Are you okay?
Who's the black private dick who's a sex machine with all the chicks? Shaft! Can you dig it? They say this cat Shaft is a bad mother. Shut your mouth. I'm talking about Shaft.